On behalf of the USC Casden Institute, the Stanford University Pathways Lab, the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Feminist Futures Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, we're proud to present tonight's event, Indentured Servants, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt. Well, there have been many overlapping crises in America that intersect with the student debt burden that holds generations back from success. Tonight's event marks the Casden Institute's second foray into exploring both the complex origins of the current student debt crisis and reimagining solutions for the students of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. One thing I'd like to make clear from the start, that the question of student debt relief is not a Democratic or Republican issue, a left or right. Rather, we all see it as a nonpartisan issue that affects 45 million Americans across political and demographic lines. Tonight's event will begin with an introduction by Representative Jamal Bowman of New York, and it will be followed by clips from the second episode of the award-winning documentary series, Scared to Debt, and this episode will be titled The Whistleblower. The clip will be followed by a panel discussion of academic and community leaders that will be moderated by Professor Elizabeth Shermer of Loyola University and author of the book Indentured Servants. We'll leave time at the end for questions and answers so that you in the audience can participate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest, Congressman Jamal Bowman. Congressman Bowman represents New York's 16th District, which includes Northern Bronx and parts of Westchester County, including Yonkers, New Rochelle, and Mount Vernon. Bowman was born in New York and spent his early years in public housing and rent-controlled government apartments. He was raised by his mother, who supported the family on a post office worker's salary. And after graduating from the University of New Haven, Representative Bowman worked as a crisis intervention teacher in a Bronx public school and went on to earn master's degree in guidance counseling from Mercy College and a doctorate in education from Manhattanville. In 2009, Bowman founded the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, a Bronx middle school focused on advancing student involvement in science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And Bowman has been an outspoken advocate for rethinking education, including ending state-sanctioned yearly standardized testing. Congressman Bowman was elected to the House in 2020, running on a platform of transformative progressive policies that promise to improve the lives of those who have been legislated out of the American dream. He's also advocated policies that infuse climate justice with economic and racial justice and stress the importance of investing in communities of color. We welcome Representative Jamal Bowman to USC this evening.
Peace and love, everyone. It's Congressman Jamal Bowman here. Happy New Year to all of you out there. I'm so honored to be with you to discuss the urgent need to cancel student loans. First, I want to thank University of Southern California President Carol Folt and Dr. Steve Ross, as well as Lisa Ansell of the Casden Institute for putting this event together. When we come together, our power and our ability to create change is unmatched. I've always said that we have to work every day to realize all of our untapped potential. You know, when I think about student loans, I think about what so many students, including myself, were told. Go to school, take out the loans, be a good student. It's worth it. You'll get a good paying job. Now, I loved being a teacher, but teaching wasn't a job that paid us that much, especially many years ago. They told us you'll be able to buy a home, save money, and have a family. Our students were told that if they did everything right, their full potential and their dreams would be realized. That just isn't the reality on the ground. Right now, we are in the middle of a once again surging global pandemic that has upended our lives, and thankfully, because of the pressure we put and the very real need of millions of people, President Biden has extended the pause on student loan payments. First, the federal student loan payment pause was set to expire on January 1st. Because of all of us and organizing efforts that advocates undertook, that deadline has now been extended to May 1st. That's 3 more months of relief for millions. That tells us that our strategy is working, and we cannot stop until President Biden fulfills his promise and cancels all student loans. Canceling student loans doesn't require Senator Manchin's or any other legislator's approval. This is something that the president has the authority to do all on his own, and it will restart our economy in the midst of this global pandemic. Without cancellation, millions of people will yet again be faced with terrible choices between paying off their loans or putting food on the table, or paying for childcare, or paying medical bills. Student debt is a national crisis. It was a crisis before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's even a bigger one now. Right now, over 40 million borrowers owe a combined $1.8 trillion in loans. Many borrowers see their debt increase despite years of paying hundreds of dollars every month on time because they can't even keep up with the interest. Far too often, it can take a borrower over a decade to pay off their loans, and many borrowers end up defaulting because they simply cannot make ends meet with such high payments. Meanwhile, for-profit loan companies are lining their pockets with money that could otherwise be spent in our communities, keeping small businesses afloat and strengthening our economy. The fact that this crisis not only affects people financially, but it can also affect the mental and physical health of borrowers trapped under exorbitant student loan payments. That makes it harder for people to fully participate in the economy over the long term. So this is not just the right thing to do, but it will put more money in people's pockets, boost the economy, and allow borrowers to actually accomplish and realize the things they were promised. Now is the time to cancel student loans. Thank you all for having me. Peace and love. Please stay safe and be well.
Thank you, Representative Bowman, for your advocacy on behalf of student loan forgiveness. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Shermer. Elizabeth Tandy Shermer is an associate professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, where she teaches courses in 20th century U.S. history. She's held research fellowships across the United States and around the world, including Cambridge University, the Rockefeller Foundation in Bellagio, and the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. In addition to her book, Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in Student Debt, she is the author of Sunbelt Capitalism, Phoenix and the Transformation of American Politics. She's the editor of Barry Goldwater and the Remaking of the Political Landscape, and co-editor of The Right and Labor in America, Politics, Ideology, and Imagination. And her articles and op-eds have appeared in Bloomberg News, Huffington Post, History News Network, and the Washington Post. We welcome Elizabeth Shermer.
Thank you. I want to thank Steve Ross, Lisa Ansel, and Caitlin Berman, and everyone involved in putting this event together and spreading the word that so many of you could Zoom in with us tonight. Tonight's event is a panel discussion that I'm thrilled to be moderating between Jon Oberg, Jonathan Gleeter, Mitchell Stevens, Kiyomi Kowalski, and Adam Kalenj. And I'll introduce them properly before the discussion begins, I promise. But I'm particularly honored that Lisa suggested we use the title of my recent book for this event, Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt. And I always tell people to read the dedication. It's at the front of the book, to the more than 45 million of us, because I'm one of you, trying to pay off more than $1.7 trillion in college debt. Some of us have had our repayments and interest accruals paused during the pandemic with the promise that payments will begin in May. And honestly, doesn't sometimes when you see those news releases, it seems like a threat what we're hearing from the administration. Only a few have had our loans canceled through the poorly named public sector loan forgiveness program. Poorly named because none of us have done anything wrong. No one needs to be forgiven for having to go into debt to go to college. This country needs people, regardless of their citizenship status, to get more education. And there's nothing wrong with individuals benefiting from something that should be a public good, not the private luxury that higher education has become. And I think the acknowledgments of this book are also important because I explain how I came to this project. Cleaning out my father's house when I had no idea how I'd manage his care and keep my job, a question that many women ask themselves when they find themselves providing care. And then finding the loan documents that I signed when I was 17 years old and am still paying off. And at the time, I believed what textbooks insisted and education experts presumed. This student debt crisis was recent, and the unintended consequences of legislation, the celebrated 1965 Higher Education Act, passed, again, as the textbooks keep telling me, the best of intentions. But that's not what I actually found when I went digging in archives. Actually, as 1960s lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, intended to create a student loan industry over the objections of leading bankers at the time, which might seem strange, said to me at first, because that loan program, the guaranteed student loan program, the guarantee was not that students could go to college, not that parents could afford it, not that campuses would get the financial support to expand to meet demands for their research, their service, and the degrees that so many workers need, some of them finally being recognized as essential. No, the guarantee was that bankers would be repaid for an inherently risky financial product. And let me break this down for you. I'm going to give you a loan for something that I can't actually repossess. And even if I could repossess that degree, or those college credits, I actually can't sell it to someone else. And even if I could, you would then never have the credentials to compete for the well-paying job to pay me back. Oh, and by the way, usually the collateral for you getting that loan was being admitted to a college and university that needed your tuition revenue. Now, lawmakers modeled that guaranteed student loan program on the 1930s federal mortgage program. And I emphasize that because it also had a guarantee for bankers. That's where the idea came from. But as countless researchers have shown, that program deepened this country's systemic racial, gender, and class inequities, just like the student loan program. And that's why I trace today's student loan crisis, which disproportionately leaves students of color, especially women, drowning in debt. And the reasons for that stretch back to college and universities discriminating against applicants, federal and state lawmakers preferring to offer students and parents complicated financial products instead of directly investing in college and universities to free most of them from their historic reliance on tuition, and then crafting loan programs that made billions for banks who took advantage of a program that incentivized them to make loans risky for students and parents who would then be forced to repay. And that's why where tonight's first clip comes into from the Scared to Debt documentary, award-winning. And we are lucky enough to have the whistleblower profiled Jon Oberg with us this evening. Let's watch the first clip.
It was when I was in the research office that I discovered fraudulent claims, illegal claims in the student loan area, and brought to the attention of Congress, which shut them off. Eventually, I went to court to recover the funds that the Department of Education was not collecting back from those who had done the overcharging. And I have been in litigation then for 11 years. At least 9, and perhaps more, of the loan holders, that is the secondary markets and so on, were making manipulations of the loans back into those pools, those issues that predated 1993, but they were really new loans, and they were mischaracterizing them. I know the law. This should not be happening. What is the explanation for it? And I did, at that point, think about my responsibility as a civil servant. To whom should I report this? I've been blocked here from looking into it by the chain of command. But do I have an obligation because I am a civil servant? I took an oath in my work to follow the laws of the United States. I knew something about the field. I knew that these were the kinds of things that very clever people could probably put over on a department that wasn't interested really in looking at whether or not there were abuses and illegal claims. The Office of General Counsel, the Office of Ethics said, well, yes, indeed, there is. There is a law. There is known as the Lloyd Lafollette Act. And that act permits individual civil servants on their own time to contact their congressional delegation or to contact agencies of the Congress, such as the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. At first, it was in the tens of millions, then into the hundreds of millions, and then the risk was into the billions, at which time Congress cut it off prospectively.
So I'm excited to be able to introduce Jon Oberg tonight, along with our other panelists. Jon Oberg worked in the Department of Education and helped expose the commercialization of higher education and the ways that social policies reinforce the gap between rich and poor. Jonathan Gleeter is now a Berkeley professor of law focusing on higher education access, but he actually started out as a reporter covering the business of American higher education. Mitchell Stevens is a Stanford professor of education and co-director of the Pathways Lab, which explores how learning opportunities can be made more effective, equitable, enjoyable, and humane. Kiyomi Kowalski is a veteran and a law school graduate who chairs both the Social Justice Collective and Anti-Racism Task Force for the Board of Jewish Education at Valley Outreach Synagogue in Calabasas. Alan Kalenge actually founded Student Loan Justice back in 2005, a grassroots organization critical to putting the student debt and canceling it on the mainstream political agenda. Just one reason of many, after the publication of his book, The Student Loan Scam, he was named a CNN Money Magazine financial hero. So my first question to all of these activists, educators, and whistleblowers experts: what should we do now with the end of the moratorium now set for May 1st? What is our pathway to immediate action? Don't all jump in at once.
Sure, I'll go first. I think I think Ellie, you and Jon have both modeled for us what we should be doing in the near term. Ellie, in your remarks, even at the opening, is we all need to be screaming bloody murder that the student loan crisis is a social justice issue, that it is a red alert, red light, COVID crisis, exaggerated national emergency. It is not a technical matter. It's not a mere policy question. It is a life and livelihood and civil society threatening national emergency. It's essential that we do that because the narrative of good debt that the congressman mentioned has to be replaced with other narratives. There have to be other ways of making sense of that $1.7 trillion and as many counter narratives as the prevailing good debt narrative can receive, the better off we're going to be. So I just can't emphasize enough the importance of sustaining a lively social movement around the debt circumstance, and I'm so grateful to Alan and his colleagues for framing the debt issue as both a short-term emergency and as a long-term civil society issue.
I completely agree. And next, I'd love to hear from Jonathan Gleeter.
Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion of such an important topic, because as Professor Stevens alluded, access to higher education is only going to become more important as our world gets more and more complicated. I guess in response to your question, it's complicated because there's a short and a long-term problem, right? And in the short term, assuming payments restart, we've seen in press coverage over the past several years that the companies that manage the student loan portfolio for the Federal Department of Education don't always do right by students. And so there's going to be a tremendous need for oversight, right? And it's going to be very important for student borrowers to keep careful track of whether the payments they've made in the past are properly accounted for, and whether payments they're making are being allocated to their balances correctly, and so on. That means there's also an important role for regulators. California has a student borrower bill of rights, for example. California has a student loan servicing act. So there are oversight mechanisms at the state as well as the federal level at agencies that beyond the Department of Education to ensure that this restart doesn't disadvantage borrowers in ways that it could. But I guess having said all that, that's taking an incremental perspective, and I would not want addressing these very real, especially to student borrowers, these very real and potentially significant issues. I wouldn't want addressing that to forestall the broader debate that we really should be engaging in about how should we be financing higher education? How is it that the burden of financing higher education has come to be allocated so heavily toward students and families as opposed to on the wider public when we all benefit from greater availability of higher education?
Jon, did you want to jump in or?
Yes, you're hearing from me enough tonight, but I will say a couple of words here on that question. I thought I would be brief and mention 5 words and then elaborate just briefly on them. The one word is complicity. Another is obligation. Another is proportionate. Another is LS&T powers. And the 5th one is bankruptcy. By complicity, I think we need to ask, what is the role of the U.S. Department of Education in being complicit in driving up our total debt to 1.8 trillion? The term obligation goes to my reading of the powers that the Secretary of Education has under the so-called compromise and settle statute. I read it as an obligation that goes with the powers, not just the powers alone. There's an obligation, I believe, for the Department of Education to recognize its own complicity in driving up student debt. The word proportionate is to how much complicity was there, and can the secretary use those powers that are given to him in statute and do not require additional authorization from the Congress in order to remediate a lot of the damage that has been done. The LS&T powers that I mentioned could be used right now because we have a crisis not only in the total amount that we have, 1.8 trillion, but it is growing. And what is the Department of Education doing about it? The secretary has powers in order to address the kinds of situations that have come up in the news in the past couple of weeks. One is the so-called 568 cartel lawsuit against 16 elite universities and how they have been conspiring to drive net tuition up for the low income. The secretary has powers to deal with that. The other news came today with regard to the big lender and servicer, Navient, and the settlement that Navient struck with 39 state attorneys general. The question is, of the Secretary of Education, what are you going to do about this situation? Why does it take 39 state attorneys general to handle this situation? What is the department doing about it? And lastly, bankruptcy. And others can talk about this too, but I think that could be done immediately to restore. The Department of Education does not need to take a stand immediately against all bankruptcy
actions as they have done. We thought that was going to be taken care of by now, but it hasn't. So those are 5 words that came to my mind as to what the Department of Education ought to be working on right now.
Thank you so much for those insights. But I'd love to hear from some of our activists on this call, like Kiyomi and Alan, about where they think we should do at this very critical moment when we've had yet another extension.
Yeah, we're in some tight times right now. Thank you for having me tonight. We got a quick four months before people are paying. I am one of these people who settled down with student debt, much like Ellie here. And I would have to pay my mortgage, what I pay in mortgage currently to live in California, additionally to student loans if I were to begin repaying. So, so I feel this urgency and I'm getting a little anxious even thinking about it. But I think what we need to look at is the equity issues around this. The people who are educated and most likely in the student loan bucket are the least fortunate group among us, right? Like are least able to pay back loans. If you had parents and things that paid for your student loans, you are not in this bucket. So we need to think about that. And then when I think about the equity piece, I specifically think about how we're in this moment where we're talking about reparations, and the idea around reparations is to kind of level the field, ideally, for past wrongdoings. And because I think of Black women specifically as being the most educated voting bloc and earning the least in any given field, I think that this should be a student loan forgiveness or debt cancellation should be a part of a reparations package. I also happen to be a veteran, and I think people who serve active duty or reserve, who put their bodies on the line for the United States, should have a loan forgiveness. They should not be commodifying our education, and that's a major problem. So we need, I agree with Jonathan. We need to have a couple tracks going here. So immediately, May 1st, what do? I think we bang on doors and say, starting this loop again is not going to work for us. And next, we have to have a long-term paradigm shift around education in this country. Like we have to take it out of the commodity realm. So generally, there's a lot of thoughts that come to my head, but it's causing a bit of anxiety. I have to be honest.
For so many of us. And I love what you brought up. And especially, I just want to think back to something that you brought up in terms of like just the anxiety of it and having to figure out all this and all these different obligations. But something that Jonathan brought up about having to sort of be able to carefully document. I am one of the people who has applied through public sector loan forgiveness. They have lost 18 months of payments from me, and they have actually gotten my documentation wrong. Unfortunately, they mess with the wrong person because my accountant tells me that I probably could relax on my record keeping. But I do, in fact, actually have the first 18 months records of my thing, which I can submit to them in different forms to sort of corroborate that this is actually what was happening. In fact, I was paying the Department of Education before they sent my loans to Mohila. And I think though, but as I think about, when your accountant tells you, you could dial it back on the organizational talent that you have. But I think about so many people, and even myself as a young person, how do you keep track of all of these documentation when there's so much? And it just seems yet another way to blame someone for not handling that so-called good debt. And I think to me, it's a window in so many of all of these programs that we have in the United States that we're going to blame you if it doesn't work out for you. But a lot of these programs are extremely complicated financial products.
Oh, I'll just jump in here. I'm an educated person. I have a GED. I just found out like a month ago that the loans that I was paying timely payments of $0.00 based on being in the income-based repayment program, because I'm primarily a mom and an activist, and I work in the not-for-profit sector primarily. They put me in forced forbearance for 2 years on loans. I was paying timely payments of $0.00. So those are lost payments currently for 2 years. And I'm like, I didn't need to be in forbearance. I didn't have to pay you anything. So yeah, and that's something I'm going to have to fight about, and possibly not. But I'm a person who's generally paying attention, and I had no idea that was what was going on.
But I think exactly you being identifying as primarily as a mom, me as someone who is doing elder care, is that this is the example of why women have such a hard time climbing out of this debt. We are the ones so often moving in and out of the labor force, and it does not matter that our debts keep accruing and that we're actually doing, again, work finally being recognized as essential. Finally being recognized as essential. I have not given Alan a chance to weigh in here about, Alan, what should we be doing right now?
Yeah, great question. For two quick little history bits, in 1965, when they rolled out the Higher Education Act, President Lyndon Baines Johnson declared that these loans should be free of interest. And today, $100 billion a year clicks off during non-COVID years on this loan portfolio. So going back even further, I hearken back to the founding of this country, the founding fathers, who they themselves were being skewered under debt to British banks, and the king's men. They called for uniform bankruptcy laws ahead of the power to declare war and raise an army. So here we are today. Student loans are the only type of loan to be uniquely stripped of this protection. Now, nobody wants to file for bankruptcy. It's a terrible thing to have to do. It's stigmatizing, etc. But I think the founders were onto something here. You've got to have the threat of bankruptcy in order to keep a lending system viable, the prices rational, and the student loan violation of their wisdom proves their wisdom in spades. But the current situation is that even before COVID, 80%, 4 out of 5 of all borrowers were either not paying, and that's over half, like 51% were not paying at all. Another 30% were paying and paying and paying, but their loan balances were going up. So that's like 38 million out of the 45 million federal borrowers who, like myself and Ellie and Kiyomi, are losing sleep over our loans. And we vote, 45 million people. If you throw in the 15 million people who either have private loans or are co-signed on them, well, that's nearly enough people to elect a president outright. So, we were headed to cartoonish territory. I have to say, the lending system, in my humble opinion, is now essentially dead. The subprime home mortgage crisis, the default rate was 20%. Well, we now know that for 2004 borrowers who are borrowing less than a third of what is being borrowed today is 40%, and that was a projection pre-COVID, probably going to be a little higher than that. But, we're talking about a default rate today, if they were to turn on the lending program May 1st, within 9 months, of well over 50%. So we really have to start asking ourselves, is this lending system even real anymore? I mean, it's a very important question. So as it stands right now, my number one piece of advice is that before May 1st, there's a bill in the Senate right now, S-2598. It's not a perfect bill, but it returns limited bankruptcy rights to federal student loans that are more than 10 years old. It's the best we could get. There's another bill that is not likely to go anywhere, HR 4907, that returns bankruptcy to private loans. Come May 1st, we're going to see a mass default. We are. My best estimate, less than 50% were paying before the pandemic. Come May 1st, it's going to be down to 20, maybe 25% at the most. We're going to see a mass default, and the collection industry is drooling at that prospect. All the powers they have that I won't get into now, they would love to see a mass default in the continued absence of both bankruptcy protections and statutes of limitations. So I really hope that we can get S-2598 passed through the Senate as quickly as possible. And quite frankly, I think that's a necessary and needed precondition in order to get President Biden, who quite frankly has betrayed us on loan cancellation up to this point, in order to light a fire under him. I think we need the threat of bankruptcy back. I think in all cases, we need the threat of bankruptcy back on our side. Hopefully, hopefully no one will have to file, will have to actually file. But the threat, in my mind, is what is just so important.
Before we get to Mitchell and Alan, you're talking about the Senate bill is actually the bipartisan piece of legislation, if I'm remembering that correctly, that
Yes.
is actually, it is a bipartisan thing. And I can't help adding this because I've done so much of this work, wrote so much of this abroad. I speak to a lot of international audiences who want me to warn not to go down the American path. And that's literally, I was doing an event with the person who designed the Australian loan model. And he said, we were like, just not do what the Americans did. But I think the thing that was interesting about both the British and the Australian was it was built with the expectation that about anywhere up to about a third would not ever be able to pay back the loans, but they would be canceled after a certain point. And I think that that's an interesting thing for us to sit with. But I want to hear from Mitchell. Muted.
I appreciate this discussion, and I advocated earlier for keeping the fire in the social movement alive. Social movements need targets, and I'm a little wary, frankly, of making the Cardona Department of Education the sole or even the primary target, because in fact, the boogeyman here is actually, legacies of Department of Education and congressional policy. And it's hard to have a social movement against the past. I think that the Biden administration is actually a good target, but I think we need to be thinking about other targets as well. Frankly, I suggest that the movement should target the elite, well-endowed, high tuition schools whose business models, frankly, are built substantially around professional degree programs that suck up a very large proportion of the of student loan debt. And Stanford University is among them. I think that and perhaps other schools represented on this call. I think the universities get away with murder by advertising how well they take care of the tiny number of entering freshmen who receive generous financial aid and perhaps independent of loans. But the bread and butter of a lot of elite private schools is professional master's degree programs. And in my view, we deserve to be targets of this social movement because we need to account for the way in which our own academic and business practices have over many generations contributed to producing the problem we have today. It shocks me that elite schools like the one I have the privilege of working for are not targets of this movement. So I think we need to think broadly about all of the different parties who are implicated in this problem. And frankly, I'm implicated in this problem because my well-compensated, low teaching load, resource-intensive research agenda is subsidized partly by that $1.7 trillion. We have to talk about that if we're going to have a comprehensive understanding of this problem.
I completely agree. Before I turn it over, Jonathan, I just want to add actually that's also what UK universities are doing too. Money-making master's programs. It's a big an issue for them too as they transition more and more away from state programs. Jonathan, take it away to you.
I just want to expand on what Professor Stevens put so eloquently because it's very tempting to target the high tuition, the high sticker price, even the high net price of these institutions, net price being the price after financial aid is taken into account. But I don't want to lose sight in picking one of these targets for illustrative purposes of the deeper issue. I was on a panel like this at a law school a few years ago, and a student stood up in outrage and said, it just costs too much. Why does it cost so much? And my response was, why do you care what it costs? You should care who's paying for it. We could make it really, really cheap and really, really bad. That's not what we want, right? So, I mean, the allocation question is the one that we don't want to lose, even as we're leveling criticism at the choices institutions are making about how they pay for, how they cross-subsidize, how they pay for the resources that they're providing to students. Just one more, because I also want to touch on what Alan was saying a sec ago. I think that there are a number of really important policy fixes we should be thinking about. Bankruptcy is definitely one. The exceptional treatment of student loans in bankruptcy has come under fire for a long time. There are others that we can think about, like defaulting student borrowers into repayment plans that are contingent on income, which I think has already been alluded to. Why isn't that the default option? That seems to me that everybody just ought to be automatically in that kind of plan. That's an incremental fix, but it's pretty important incremental fix. And then we obviously can't forget about the equity issues. The fact that we've made choices, and I suspect we'll be coming back to this later, the fact that we've made choices about higher education finance that involve debt. Not everybody needs to borrow. There's a built-in equity consideration, right, created by the systemic choices we've alluded to that other countries, right, as Dr. Shermer has alluded, other countries have made different choices. So I'll stop. Thanks.
I'd like to say that we could make the schools, the master's programs and so on, targets, yes. They deserve scrutiny, that's for sure. But not at the expense, I think, of targeting Secretary Cardona and the Biden administration. This is where the decisions can be made right now in order to correct a lot of the problems that are ongoing. Secretary Cardona has already made some admirable decisions that have solved some problems in the borrower defense area, solved those lawsuits. In the permanent and total disability area, solved a lot of those problems. He has done very well, in my estimation, to take on the public service loan forgiveness fiasco that was created by the servicer FIA. These are where the levers of power are. In the secretary's office. This is where the statute focuses solutions. The compromise and settlement, the limitation, suspension, and termination, that is where solutions can come from. And so with Secretary Cardona, I'd like to make the point, as far as I know, he is as clean as a hound's tooth on this. This isn't this is a legacy problem of the Department of Education being complicit in many of these activities that have.
But John, can I suggest also we can't underestimate the extent to which the education department is beholden to the higher education lobby, which lives and breathes on the current student loan process, right? I mean, I will be personally thrilled if the Cardona administration is able to finally exclude for-profit players from Title IV. But I have a hard time imagining he's going to take on something that will conflict with the vested interests of Ivy League institutions. So I just think we need to pluralize, who's the responsibility for this complicated mess we're in.
I also want to jump in, and I completely appreciate and everything that Mitchell was talking about in terms of putting our gaze on these elite institutions. But I also think that one of the things that COVID laid bare is what so many other institutions are actually providing for students, because there has been such a retrenchment of the public sphere. So we have most UC campuses, if not all, have food banks because they are on the front lines of dealing with food insecurity. We also have housing insecurity. And I know that my alma mater, UCSB, made headlines for Dormzilla. However, that just speaks actually to the issue of UCSB is actually on the forefront, like Santa Cruz is on the forefront of a massive housing crisis in California. And what's happening to college universities, as my brilliant friend, Kat Ramirez at UC Santa Cruz says, is what we are being asked to do, what K through 12 schools have been doing for decades. We are being asked to do all of the public services that have not been done. So why was the CPS schools across the street from me open, delivering meals during the pandemic? The children were not in classes, but they were delivering meals because that is what we have put our educators on the front lines of doing. And I think that there's an important work done at the Hope Center out of Temple to highlight all of this. And I think one of the challenges in dealing with what the brilliant Christina Groger calls the higher education ecosystem is that we have everything from hard scrabble community colleges doing such important work to very elite universities. And in between is just the pressure that is being put on these institutions. And it's hard to suss out because it's so effing complex about what we're doing and just the many needs for this. And I got to say, like, as a historian, I do want to put the pressure on now and focusing on the now, but I do want people to remember where they are because I cannot stand hearing people talk about how we should go back to the way things were. Actually, we never had the emphasis in 65 was on the loan program. I know it's buried in Title IV. I was once fooled, but it was the heart and soul of what they were trying to do was generate the student loan industry to stop that investment. And I think that that's so important to recognize, and especially since there's some folks in the chat who, when we open it up, they want to hear even more about Navient, is Navient comes out of Sally Mae. Congress intentionally created Sally Mae to make the student loan industry more profitable for bankers in 1972. That cannot be forgotten. That it's not just the Department of Education that's complicit of this, but also Congress itself. This is what they chose. And they modeled it off a program that so many have shown are just exactly complicit in inequities that Kiyomi talked about so beautiful.
Preach on, sister.
Hey, I would maybe just add a quick point, riffing on what Jonathan and John both alluded to, and that is the Department of Education, the captured nature of the agency, I think income contingent repayment or something like that, I'm agnostic, is a good idea. However, we know that it's not just public service. It's IBR, it's ICR, IDR, pay, repay. Every loan repayment program going back to 1993, the failure rate has been literally 99.9%. Like 32 people, enough people they could fit in my living room, and I live in a small apartment, made it through of the millions who tried for ICR. So instead of repeating the mistakes, I would love to see a working income-driven contingent repayment program. But again, it comes back to bankruptcy. The Department of Education fights tooth and nail to keep this right gone, and for very good reasons. I think only with bankruptcy in place can we expect the Department of Education to act with a modicum of good faith.
Well, it's that leverage, right? Like we are in a capitalist society. For whatever it's worth, and that leverage of bankruptcy saying, hey, you're not going to get paid if you don't work with me, is really critical to kind of give the borrower some sort of power. And without that, we just keep getting steamrolled. And I am very, I'm not optimistic about them changing the rules around bankruptcy. Because I always hear, because I can't repossess your brain.
Right. I've been doing this for 16 years. I can't believe I've been doing it for 16 years. Finally, we have a good bill, bipartisan, in the Senate, this S-2598. I think it's got a chance, but I think a lot has to happen in order for it to pass. So I'm hopeful.
And I do actually think that I want to recognize the important work that Alan has done. And actually, Jonathan did also as a reporter, too, in actually bringing this. Because Jonathan, we just accidentally discovered that he's actually all over my footnotes in the final chapter of the book. I had not realized that that it was one and the same person. But I think what we can all agree on in this first question about what to do right now, and as Kiyomi beautifully said, just 4 short months, right? It's actually less than that, is to keep yelling. And there are so many things to be yelling about, so many things to, as so many progressives have been saying, that this is a question of racial, gender, and class justice. This is what this is. To be yelling that we want Congress, the education department, to do something, to yell about recognizing what some college and university have been shown to be doing, to be on the front lines of providing food and housing security technology, but also recognizing the complicity of that, to just keep yelling about a very complicated, very, as Mitchell said, and Alan was alluding to, a very broken system in the 4 months that we have. And I think on that note, I'd love for us to move on to the second clip of the Scared to Debt documentary, again, featuring our whistleblower, Jon Oberg.
The student loan disease, so to speak, the addiction to student loans permeated all of higher education. And we're seeing the fallout now in the fact that we have, in total, amounts borrowed exceeding $1.5 trillion. And we have, I want to be clear here that some people have been able to borrow. They've been able to borrow within limit. They have been able to pay their loans off. In that sense, it has worked. But there are huge numbers of people that the system has not worked for, and they have been trapped in it. And the tragedy of it is that in many cases, it is not the borrower's own fault. The borrower did nothing wrong. It is the school messed it up. The guarantee agency messed it up. The servicer did. The Department of Education did. And no one will take responsibility, because that is not the orientation these days of the Federal Department of Education. It is still very much a revolving door kind of operation. Iron triangles are formed now and again, and there just is no sympathy for those who really have no recourse, who are the weakest in the system, and they say, well, go talk to somebody else. We're not going to help you.
There's a lot to think about, not only in that first clip, but also the first part of our discussion, where I asked, what should we do right now in the less than 4 months that we have left with this moratorium? So my question is, what do we do after that? What are, as we hinted at in our first discussion, the long-term solutions, the questions that we should be going after? And I actually want to start with the activists who have been a part of putting this on the nation's agenda, Kiyomi and Alan, if they'll jump in with where they would like to go after May 1st.
Go ahead, Alan. What are your thoughts here?
You know, it's hard for me to think beyond this pandemic. You know, I have been so focused on the problem at hand and fighting for the 45 million people right now. Probably 42 or something million of them are probably never going to be able to repay their loans. I'm sort of frankly agnostic. I like the idea of something like what Jonathan mentioned, income contingent repayment. I like the idea of free college, quite frankly. College in Mexico, in Russia, in Cuba, in China, in the Netherlands, in Germany is essentially free. Now, can we not figure that out? I mean, come on. We're supposedly the largest, most powerful country in the nation in the world. Can we not educate our citizens at least a rational price? I would hope so.
Yeah, Alan, I'm thinking more pragmatically, I'm thinking more of a triage type situation. Okay, who can how can we wipe off the most amount with the one single policy? And I think you have to go towards groups of people. I think since I spoke briefly about reparations and kind of wrapping it up in that type of package. That's a significant amount of loans that we can wipe away. It's kind of two birds, one stone. if we can wrap that up in a reparations package for people who are descendants of the enslaved. And then I think people who are earning the least, that's women, right? Like, I mean, so I'm not ashamed to say we need a triage situation, and let's just see who we can knock out over time. I want to see it all gone. But if they're going to say, oh, we don't have money for this, the whole bit, let's knock it out in waves.
I actually love that strategy, Kiyomi. This is an African-American issue. This is a woman's issue, as you say. They hold 2/3 of the debt. This is a seniors issue, believe it or not. There are more people there are more people over 50, and this has not been reported. There are more people over 50 than under 25 with student loans. This is arguably a red state issue. This is a veterans issue. They are uniquely targeted by these for-profit colleges. And, if you take that approach, pretty soon you whittle away at the pie and pretty much there's no pie left at the end of it. So it's kind of like, that's certainly an interesting strategy.
I'm curious what Jon, who was in the Department of Education for so many years, Jon, what do you think should happen? What should our long-term solutions be after we deal with the immediacy of the question of what happens before May 1st?
Well, this is a subject I like to discuss. I'm a political scientist. I've been trying to answer this question for 50 years. We certainly do need to look comparatively at other countries and how they do it. I am a graduate of a German university, for example, and in that, we could learn a lot from the German system in how they balance loans against grants, how they balance state versus federal contributions to higher education costs. So that would be one thing that we could do. I think one of the problems here is in talking about free college or in talking about some of the other schemes, we have to ask the question, how do we get from where we are to there? How do we get from here to there? We will have to engage then, I think, in some very serious discussions about the different models of federalism that we have. I have written extensively on, because I believe in cooperative federalism. We did not choose cooperative federalism as our model of higher education finance. We chose instead to go 100% federal on the guaranteed student loan program, which was a disaster. We have chosen to go 100% federal on the Pell Grants. We have not asked institutions, we have not, that is colleges and universities and states, to bear their fair share. We have not tried to coordinate between the two, and it is now a huge mess. So I think we can profitably look back too at the late 1960s, the Lyndon Johnson proposal, the Richard Nixon proposal, the Alice Rivlin report, the Carnegie Commission report, as to how all this was supposed to work. And maybe go back to some of those, because it did work for a while. We did then run into great trouble during the Reagan years when we all of a sudden said, oh, let's go all loans and let's cut those grants back. Then we went in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, a huge mistake to make Sallie Mae, the government-sponsored enterprise, for profit. Then we made many of the others for profit. We put the profit motive in it. Then we opened up the Department of Education to put the fox in charge of the hen house, or many foxes in, and we had absolute abuse, waste, and fraud for a couple of decades. So there's a lot to think about here, but a lot of it is, how do we get from where we are back to a more reasonable kind of higher education financing system?
Mitchell, you were the one who started us off with boldly saying the whole system is broken. So what should we be doing?
Unmuted.
Go ahead.
Oh,
You're still muted.
I don't have sound.
Thank you. I think it's important to keep in mind just how, in this conversation, just how substantially the political economy of the United States has changed since 1992. When Alice Rivlin and her colleagues in public economics imagined the student loan system, right, college was in fact a discretionary part of the life course. There were other ways of entering into well-compensated, stable employment. In 1972, those opportunities were waning, but the full catastrophe of the transnationalization of industrial manufacturing had yet to be realized in the United States. College could be imagined as a choice and a luxury. At this moment in history, higher education is not a luxury if one wants stable, reasonably well compensated employment. But Americans have never had a conversation about who is responsible for the lifelong education and employability of Americans. By the second half of the 20th century, we'd come to an agreement that every American was owed a high school diploma. And by the third quarter of the 20th century, we came to an understanding that if one did not receive a high school diploma, it was the system that had failed the American, not the American who had failed the system. There is complete ambiguity about who is responsible for education and mobility after high school. I would suggest that the current program is defined in such a way that the state functions kind of like a benevolent relative. You'll get a little gift called a Pell Grant that you can use to pay off for some of the tuition. And then grandma and grandpa will give you a loan on the presumption that it's still your responsibility to invest in your own human capital, even though you might deserve a little bit of help from a neighbor or a relative. Well, we've seen the disastrous consequences of that, not just because the policy itself was flawed, but because the entire political economy has changed and has changed the necessity of lifelong learning in the American life course. So what I would suggest also is that we push for our national leaders and leaders in philanthropy and frankly in elite higher education to convene a national conversation about who is responsible for the lifelong learning and employability of Americans, right? How do we collectively shoulder that responsibility? It's back to Professor Gleeter's question on there is the question of how much that costs, but perhaps the larger civic question is who is responsible for paying the bill, and until we have that fundamentally normative conversation, I think it's really going to be hard to design new policies without a specification of who has table stakes in this exchange and who's responsible for what. That, I think, is something we're in a position to have a conversation about. We have the scholarship, we have the activism, we have the numbers. What I think we don't have is a definition of the problem that is sufficiently fundamental that we can ask the right question.
So let's hear from Professor Gleeter right now, actually, on that note.
I was going to step back initially just to say, after May 1st, we have to try to keep cancellation as an idea that's politically viable. I think that's hugely important. Even if it's at the low end of the dollar amounts that were kicked around in early policy discussions around cancellation, we know that people are more likely to default when they have smaller balances rather than bigger balances. And so a relatively modest amount of cancellation can go a long way towards helping some of the student borrowers who are actually struggling the most. But there's also a challenge, I think, that Professor Stevens was alluding to, that we as educators face in helping people to see higher education not as a private good, right? Not as something that just benefits the individual student. Because as soon as we go down that path, which is not to dispute anything that you said, Professor, I want to be very clear. It is, higher education is increasingly important to socioeconomic advancement and stability. But my fear is when we emphasize that point, it highlights the extent to which higher education is an individual benefit. If I go to college, I will have a higher income. And when we present it that way, one of the risks is that then, well, why should I help someone else achieve financial stability and success?
Jonathan, I might suggest that I'm suggesting that we think about human capital as infrastructure. We think about it as a national investment, like we think about bridges and tunnels, right? So to say that my lifelong employability is an important question, I think it's a public question, at least as much as a private question.
And I think that's where the framing that we as academics in particular can provide is so important, because to flip it's not flipping the script, but to show the problem from the other side, right? That it's not necessarily, or certainly not solely, about the financial benefit to the person who completes higher education. It's also all the other benefits that come, right? So health outcomes, civic participation and engagement, right? When scholars look at the benefits of greater access to higher education and a wider spread of higher education, it goes far beyond, right? Far beyond just the individual benefit of a higher income or better employment outcomes or what have you. One of the challenges, that's how it's framed, right? If you look at the UCLA survey, UCLA surveys first year students in college every year, and year over year, students talk consistently at very high rates about intellectual development and the rewards of higher education, but increasingly they always talk about employability. Right, they're more likely to talk about some of these other very pragmatic concerns, which makes perfect sense because they're borrowing to pay for it. They'd be crazy not to be worried about employability and the income benefits. Which brings me to the other thing I wanted to say beyond cancellation is action at the state level. Yeah. Right. Action at the state level in terms of greater funding. And this is a political question, greater funding of public universities, which is where most students go. And here, Dr. Shermer, I was going to throw the question back at you, because what Governor Newsom's budget proposal made me think about was, well, what would a new master plan look like if we took this document, laying out a vision for higher education in this state, and tried to update it? What would that look like? And I know you're an expert on.
Well, and those who are zooming in with us and don't know what Jonathan Gleeter is referring to, the master plan is the California promise of the 3 tiers from community college through the University of California, the Cal States in the middle, but not nearly. That doesn't, not to discount them, but they're just that beautiful 3-tiered system that was supposed to be, and for a time was, genuinely tuition free for in-state residents. That was the California dream. It was the California promise.
When was that? When was it free? I must have missed that.
It was, yes, you did, because then I was actually in my commencement address at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as I wrote about what was Clark Kerr's vision, and then unfortunately what happened to it, starting with Governor Reagan. He was a governor before he was president.
Oh, he was.
Yeah. But I think for me, I think some of the great activists in the UC system, my former colleague, Christopher Newfield, is now actually in London, would say is that I believe the dollar amount, I think this was pre-pandemic, was about $70 more for every Californian to make the UC system genuinely tuition free again. And if you think about the long-term benefits of that, and one of the things that I think of as asking Californians how they feel about having lost a seat to Texas. I was actually made in Texas, so I don't know shade to Texas. But you want to be globally competitive, you got to start reinvesting in the UC system. And by the UC system, I don't just mean the UCs, I mean all the way down. Because one of the things that I loved that Mitchell brought up is so important with his work is that lifelong learning. When the original experiment with federal tuition assistance was in the 30s, they were doing the work-study program. By the way, they would never consider a loan. They understood at the time we were trying to clean up banking after the roaring 20s, you don't do a student loan, was the assumption that that this was about tinkering with the labor market and all these other kinds of things. And the reason that they set Social Security at 65 for men, 62 for women at the time, was most Americans were not expected to live that long. So a lot of the basic components of our social welfare system and policies are actually built not only on government guaranteed financial products or complicated financial products like the mortgage program, now student lending, but it was built at a time before people could imagine Americans living easily into their 90s.
Yeah.
And I think exactly what Mitchell said, even before the transformation of the economy, that why to make it possible for people to go back at different moments of their life, not just for the degrees needed for different types of job, but as Jonathan was alluding to, actually for that edification, for something more than that. And that for me was one of the most powerful parts of both digging deep into that first work study program and the GI Bill. So many working class veterans, University of Chicago president, Robert Hutchins, right down the way from me here in Chicago, he fought the program. He said it would turn America's colleges and universities into hobo jungles. That's what he thought of veterans. But instead, veterans clamored and they wanted to take classes in the fine arts and the humanities when the New Dealers in the 1930s, along with the work study program for 16 to 25-year-olds, that's what they were thinking, but would be before adulthood, before you be on your own in the adult labor market. They also did a workers' education project, and they were amazed when they opened up, okay, communities across the country, come together, you tell us what education you want. And they assumed, you should never assume, we know how that's spelled, ask you me. And what these communities wanted was not vocational. They wanted the chance to study the fine arts. They wanted the chance to talk about public issues. They wanted the chance to have that. And it was actually in that program that you see some of the early experiments with what we think are good teaching tools, sitting in classroom discussions, all of these kinds of things. And I'm going to let Jonathan piggyback on that because I know he's got something to say about that.
I just wanted to tie what you just said to something that Professor Stevens said a moment ago about the societal benefit, right? The public good of higher education, because I think this is so important. And it's also what's disheartening about the current debate or some of the current debates around Build Back Better. When I think about whatever the shortcomings of legislation starting back in 1958 or even back to the GI Bill and moving forward, there was a vision there. Right, there was an animating vision about how higher education should be accessible, right? And there was a sense that the nation confronts a challenge, and we are going to step up to it. So it's kind of a bummer that it's the higher education accessibility pieces of Build Back Better that are not in Build Back Better. It's losing sight of precisely the point that I think Professor Stevens was making a moment ago.
I think, Mitchell has done this amazing job of it's out now. It's going to be open source of doing a special issue of Change. So everyone on the Zoom can read it. About 75 years ago, plans for Democracy for American Education. And I messed up the title. I'm really tired and energized by this discussion. And I think it was so important, but the idea of it was having free community colleges across this land to actually have that opportunity to really provide this infrastructure of it. And for me, that was personally, it wasn't the College for All Act, which would have been 4 years, but the idea of in the original Build Back Better of those 2 years of free community college, the potential of having the cost of it, but actually just speaking to the spirit of really robustly funding these really important, vital community institutions was lost in the Senate and the House negotiations over that agenda. It was very tragic.
I think we're talking about, in a veiled way, the dirty S word, socialism, right? Like right? It's a cute conversation, and we're talking about socialism. We're talking about thinking that I need to take care of my neighbor, and I need to, as a community, we reap the benefits of people being educated. That I think about UBI when I think about this. Like, there's all these community efforts, like, right. We can't even get people to wear masks. And I hate to be that guy on this call right now, or, on this panel right now. But we are really far from people changing their paradigm from themselves, a very myopic paradigm, to everyone, and the idea, and and I will say also, not to say this in academia, but like college isn't for everyone. So we do have to have these tiers, right? We have to think, okay, what does vocation look like for a person? And what does, higher education look like for a person? We have to have it for everyone. We have to meet where everyone's at so that we have a well-rounded society. Currently, we have sold everyone the dream that they must have this degree. And in order to get this degree, you have to spend X, right? And X ends up being quite a bit of money.
And Kiyomi, to get it between the ages of 18 and 22, or in my case, I enrolled when I was 17, but 17 and 22, that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. That we're all in different places, but I completely agree with you. And it speaks to something that I had wanted to talk about when folks were talking about other aspects of this, which is, there was an assumption that if you just have access to education, and in the case of the Johnson administration, we'll use this loan program. It'll be a tool to do that. We'll have access to education. That was going to solve everything else. That was going to solve, exactly as you beautifully put, the fact that women are paid less on the dollar. By the way, they didn't really care about women going to college in 65. That wasn't until 72. But we
were supposed to find husbands there. So
I know, right? So actually, by the way, okay, I can't resist that. The concern about making student loans available to women, then called co-eds, women students, was that it would saddle them with what they called a negative dowry. And so I walked around for like a week calling my student loans a negative dowry. But I think for me is this question is that why was there this assumption that all you needed to do was give people the chance to borrow to go to college, that alone was going to actually deal with the inequities built into the American labor market? Because that was the assumption. That was the assumption, questions of race, the assumptions of questions of gender. And we're still dealing with that if Michelle Obama at the end of the administration is going on about everyone just needs to fill out the FAFSA, that would be the road to this. A document, a federal document that I showed actually has roots in college price fixing and tuition assistance, similar to the case that is going on right now. And it just gets you about all of these assumptions and all of these pressures that we have assumed in the college degree. And you're absolutely right. Not everyone needs to go to college. We shouldn't preclude them, but we also shouldn't assume that you should only be able to do this between the ages of 18 and 22. It's ridiculous. I went on too long.
I maybe would just jump in a quick data point. You mentioned socialism and the boogeyman, the partisan politics. Jonathan mentioned the most recent bill where higher education funding was removed. I think a lot of that was due to Republican pressure, quite frankly. And there is no good reason for this to be a partisan issue. There is not. You mentioned Texas earlier. The state budget of Texas is $119 billion. That's a lot of money. The people of Texas owe $141 billion in mostly federal student loan debt. Georgia owes 169% of its state budget in student loan debt. So if you look at these historically red Republican states, you see that their people are being hurt worse than what is, than average. So I think there is a political opportunity right now. We are pushing the governors of Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Missouri, others to stand with us. Maybe not call for loan cancellation. I know that's a little out there for some Republicans, but certainly at a minimum, the return of bankruptcy rights. I think there's an opportunity. I have not had one governor tell me no yet. So I just want to put that out there.
Well, and Alan, I think it brings us back to the point you made so well in the first set of round of questions when I proposed the first one. What do we do now? Emphasizing we vote. Yes, we vote, but actually, it can't actually end with the voting, because then you have to hold these people accountable, like you actually dogging a Washington state senator, right? With a reporter behind you. These are the kinds of things that it does. It is continuous action. It is continuous watching and having these kinds of conversations, because we've thrown out there a lot, both in this session of questions about what to do after May 1st, but even before. The point is to keep active. The point is to keep talking. The point is to keep discussing, to put the pressure on and see and keep our focus on this incredibly complex system and all of the things that that would need to be addressed to get us to, as Ellen started the session, to getting us to a better future, because we can't keep it as the past. As Mitchell said when we first started this, it's broken. On that note, we really should take a look at the third clip from the Scared to Debt. And I'm so excited then that I can bring in all of the wonderful questions that we have been coming in throughout this discussion. I'll be reading from that and posing those questions, to the panelists after we watch this third clip.
I certainly didn't think in 2003, when I first started to give information to people, that the problem wouldn't be solved rather quickly. When I went to the Inspector General, I expected the Inspector General to say, whoa, what's going on here? I didn't expect it would take audits only 3 years later to be able to unravel the situation. So, and certainly, as I've explained, I didn't have any idea that I would be filing suit on behalf of the United States early on. I just wanted the problem to be solved. But it became clear to me that I was the person who had standing, and this money wasn't coming back unless somebody took action. And that had to be me, if anybody. We have emails that show even that high-level officials in the Department of Education would tip off their friends in the industry saying the IG is coming. And here is what you better watch out for. This is all insider information. No federal employee should be giving industry tips on how to avoid audits that are being done on behalf of taxpayers to determine whether or not claims are legal. What Secretary Spellings had done by saying, yes, the claims were illegal, but no, we're not going to recover any of the money, is set up a classic moral hazard in which the government says, oh, you're not supposed to do that, but if you do that, you don't have to pay the money back. That would only encourage those who had an inclination to make false claims or to put their own interests ahead of the borrowers and the families and taxpayers they're supposed to be serving. And it was exactly the wrong message. We did not get back in settlements $600 to $800 million, as we should have. Margaret Spelling should simply have said, yes, that money is coming back. If you look at the financial reports of those who were making the false claims, they actually expected that they would have to pay the money back. And some of them had even escrowed money in order to pay the funds back once it was determined that the claims were illegal. And she did not ask for any of it back. Under pressure, under great pressure from the lending industry, which said, oh, if we have to pay this back, it'll upset the bond markets, there will be chaos, liquidity for student loans will be threatened, all kinds of things were just nonsense. It's the loan that they were given. It's this addiction to student loans, easy money. And they misled the people and said, oh, you will get a huge salary with our education. You'll be able to pay that loan off right away. We've suffered as a nation because of it. And we haven't straightened it out yet. There have been attempts, but it is still a big mess.
Have been scrolling through the comments that y'all have been posting, and please keep them coming. We had an early question about what the panelists think about today's announcement about Navient. And I would love to hear those of you who have been following what happened today in terms of the settlement with Navient. These are privately held student loans, and what y'all think about that decision and how that impacts our conversation here about what to do now and what to do in the future. Alan, take it away.
Well, I'll just jump in. It sounds good. We have seen a lot of cases like this come and go again over the years. In this particular case, most of these loans were made between 2002 2008. They're totally private loans. Unlike federal student loans, private loans actually have statutes of limitations. And so my best guess is that many, probably all of these loans had become legally uncollectible by today's date. So while it looks like a huge number and like a huge step in the right direction, quite frankly, I think it's kind of a nothing burger. These loans were not collectible. Navient writes off this garbage paper. Thankfully, there's no tax liability because of the COVID relief bill. But I think it's a lot more flash than substance.
And what Alan was referring to is that what's actually one of the parts of one of the relief bills is that it was actually not having tax consequences for loan cancellation. Other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think the New York Times did some of the best reporting on this in allowing us to know that $1.7 billion write-off is really worth only about $50 million because those loans were uncollectible anyway. What I found good about it was that there was an indication here of, and they actually used the term predatory lending. Yes, predatory lending happens. It happens all the time. And we did have a very nice discussion there in the last session about the idea that people could borrow and so on. That was with an assumption that everything would be on the up and up. There was not a realization that things could go sour and have predatory lenders taking advantage of people mercilessly and with no recourse. And that is what has happened. So I was happy to see some of the headlines. This is a good headline. I'm not sure there's a lot of substance to the settlement, however. I've already raised the question, why did it take 39 state attorneys general to do this? Why wasn't this done by the Department of Education? Why isn't the New York Times or any other reporter going to Secretary Cardona and asking the question, did you know about this? And why didn't you do something?
So we've got another great question in the chat. It's something actually that Alan brought up a little bit earlier about older borrowers, the ones holding the most debt, have paid 3 to 4 times over, still not down the principal balance after 20 years of payment. So the question is, do the panelists think that should be the target for immediate relief by the federal government? For private loans, that they are encouraged and the guarantee that can't be repaid, being against normal lending and consumer protection standards, why can't the federal government force those private loans to be forgiven? So what would it take to get, Alan was talking about this earlier, about getting those private loans. What does it take? Why is there a difference? Wait.
Private loans are really difficult for the government to have much jurisdiction over at all. By law, the secretary and by extension the president, they can cancel all federally owned student loans by executive order. So that's most student debt. They can do it without needing one dime from the Treasury, without adding one penny to the debt. It's a very clean, beautiful solution, in my opinion. For private loans, all bets are off. In order to cancel private loans, unfortunately, the government is going to have to pass a law, raise money, I assume buy back those loans from the private lenders, probably at a premium. only to then cancel them. So private loans are just a really difficult issue as far as what the federal government can do, what they can't do.
We also have concerns in the chat about how it really seems only recently that public discussion has been about the systemic racial and gender inequities built into this crisis. What do y'all think about why that has been missed? Because it has finally been shown, you can't refute it, that the debt burden is borne most by students of color, families of color. It is hardest for women to pay back. Why did it take us this long to recognize it, and what can we do to keep this as a part of the discussion about this social justice crisis?
I'm gonna ask y'all white guys why it takes so long. I mean, I know, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's been a part of my conversation for some time. I think we get into these moments where the cultural zeitgeist turns on a certain perspective, and it's that moment. And we gotta capitalize while we can. The fact is, why are you gonna ring the alarm on something that benefits you, right? If you're the one, if you're mostly the person who's coming out on top, and these are people who are able to pay student loans, they're getting their full 100 pennies on the dollar. Like, what alarm are you really gonna ring? I would love to say, oh, they just missed it. But did they? I mean, could you? I don't know. I think we've been talking about women being underpaid for a really long time. And then you put race as an intersection there, and you're in even worse shape. It just seems to me like a no-brainer.
I would like to try that. Historically, in 2007, we knew that the default rate for African Americans was 400 or 500% higher than for white students. Quite frankly, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think that was more a feature than a bug. And I don't have anything to back this up strongly, but if you look at people like Albert Lord, for example, comes from an old southeast slave-owning family. He's got some very interesting personal perspectives on the Civil War, etc. I have to wonder if maybe that was sort of baked into the cake. Again, I can't
baked into the American cake anyway, like across industries, right? So yes, I am not a conspiracy theorist myself, but like that's always baked into the apple pie of America, right?
Yeah,
well, I think
certainly.
I was going to say, I think we can't forget just how racially stratified and segregated the higher education ecosystem is. I mean, Tressie Cottom and Laura Hamilton and other people's work has made this clear more recently. But for as much as it celebrates diversity officially and explicitly, the post-secondary system is starkly stratified by race and institutional wealth. And so, that has enabled a segmentation of markets that, in fact, here's again is where I think the well-endowed schools, made a huge ethical error during the for-profit college debacle. What they did essentially was they blamed the problem of higher education finance on predatory for-profit schools, which of course exempted them from any self-scrutiny about their role in the financial organization of higher education. I think the gender myopia is requires a different explanation, and I would suggest that might be that. We were academics and educational researchers were so busy celebrating the advance and progress of women in higher education that we forgot to recognize the material costs that are the underbelly of that progress. I frankly think it's partly that I believe that Americans believe too much in the value and promise of higher education. We have too much faith that it creates opportunities and solves problems. It approximates a kind of American religion, and it's hard to call heresy on something that so many of us believe so deeply in. But unfortunately, for better or worse, the time is now, and I hope we empower more heretics.
I have to say, I remember very clearly when I matriculated at UVA in 1999. And they were very proud of that. Was the first year, a school that was not good on admitting women after the 65 Higher Education Act. That was the first year that women were the majority of my undergraduate class, my class of 2003. And I remember sitting there thinking about that. And then now, more than 20 years later, as I'd done this research, and I was like, yeah, Title IX, which has always been about more than college sports, did nothing to make sure that women would actually be able to pay for the places that they finally got in college. And it was actually in the early 90s where you see more women going to college, which is the truth today. But the question is that still has not translated, like so many people said, or as Mitchell so beautifully put, that we put this expectation that this is what higher education can solve.
Well,
other thoughts on this question?
A talk on equity recently, and I was just thrown off guard because this was not something I was following. But this man, he says, "But what are we going to do about he didn't say white, but the boys, like the boys who aren't going to school. Like, so apparently there's an entire thing about men not going or even applying to school, like, right? And it's like a whole thing. And I was just like, homie, I've got to tell you, I'm glad you're taking up that issue. It's not mine. But we're seeing women actually, dominate college campuses. But again, still getting to the career field and making significantly less, right? So, they're just, I love being educated, but I also am an educated person who drives a carpool every day.
I'd like to take a stab at the racial aspect. I did a working paper in 2003. I looked at the demographics of distribution of loans, and I found that there was one demographic group that was significantly disadvantaged by what we now call enrollment management policies at colleges and universities, and that was the Black low income. So I circulated the paper within the department and within some of the think tanks, and it got some attention. I also talked to some of the Black community, just to say, though, that reaction was very lukewarm because Washington is not organized around such questions. The lobby groups in Washington, like the HBCUs, say, this isn't an HBCU question, so we're not really interested in it. The Council on Opportunity and Education would be another group that should have an interest, but they're organized around the TRIO programs. So there was never really any interest group or anything that picked up on this. But it was well known in the Department of Education that there were these racial divides long ago. And that was based on my analysis of distribution of loans in the 1990s.
Can I jump?
Yes, of course.
I just want to going back to the question. I mean, it's clear that we're in a very different cultural moment now than we were even just 5 years ago, right? And so states of affairs that are longstanding, as Dr. Oberg just alluded to, don't look so presumptively legitimate anymore as they did before. So if you think about admissions, well, we got Varsity Blues, the scandal that folks are probably recall, where wealthy parents were effectively paying their way to get their children admitted to selective institutions. The design of the financial aid system, which disproportionately saddles students of color with larger debt burdens, doesn't look so presumptively legitimate anymore. Doesn't look like it's something that's so fair. The wealth disparities that lead to the need to borrow larger amounts right? Which we can then tie without too many steps to disparities in compensation in the labor market. Doesn't look so presumptively fair anymore. So there's far greater readiness to question, and I've noticed this just from students in the past couple of years, far greater readiness to question status quo. And that opens up some of the kinds of conversations that folks are alluding to here. That's what's exciting, because it's a point that Dr. Shermer, you made in your book, the extent to which these systems and institutions were designed for a particular population. And now members of the populations for which they are not designed are questioning, well, why?
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that you brought up the point that we're finally having this conversation, because there's a really interesting question that has emerged because of this. Is that, does it feel like when we do have these moments, for example, in the Build Back Better agenda bill, the original one, there was money specifically for historically Black college universities, minority serving institutions, and Hispanic serving institutions, collectively, individually known as HBCUs, MSIs, and HSIs. But this person asks, is that just gaslighting us? Because it's not actually tackling the larger systemic inequalities, not just in American higher education, built in there. I'm a historian from the colonial era there, but actually, but that persists. Is it just gaslighting us? Is it a way to avoid like really tackling it? What do you think? Do any of you think of anyone who is out there now trying to genuinely tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Me.
I think it is absolutely gaslighting. It's great to give money to the HBCUs. It's another thing entirely to have that lead to lower borrowing by the students. I think there's a big disconnect between the Black community and the HBCUs, and I would even say, quite frankly, the Black Congressional Caucus. If you look at well-intended bills of years past, like the gainful employment rule, and I hate to say this, but the Black Congressional Caucus really let their people down on that particular issue. They are susceptible to the same sorts of influences that all politicians are. And we saw what should have been a good way to rein in the for-profit colleges become essentially feckless and worthless as a result of pressure put on by the Black Congressional Caucus. And so that's something that is concerning.
Yeah, there's levels there, my friend. I don't think we have enough time.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I think about it. I just, my university just pivoted to online, and it actually is not as easy as just all of a sudden doing it over Zoom to do it responsibly. And I think that actually it speaks to something that Mitchell was talking about in terms of talking about these elite institutions. Jonathan Gleeter was also bringing this up too, is this question of what are the institutions that are actually trying to meet this? And I think the thing that's dangerous about for-profits is that they did meet a population eager for a degree that didn't have the time for a 4-year, or even, to be honest, some of our community colleges, they do a really important work, but so many of them you still have to go to. What are the ways that we can use these new technologies responsibly? As Janet Napolitano, when she was the head of the UC system, she emphasized that she would not go down the path of Arizona State University, which has ASU Online. It's now your benefit of Starbucks. If you want to, you can get it as a part of your employee benefit. But it is a tool in the toolkit. And is this one of the things that is helpful? I hate to say anything is helpful out of this pandemic, but shown us the technologies that need to be done to make the university more accessible. And how can we responsibly use these to have a good outcome, to recognize that we have, in some cases, 17th century institutions that need to be in the 21st century responsibly, to be a part of this. I don't know.
Yes. When the pandemic first came on, easy answer. When the pandemic first came on, one of the things that I was talking about in the local school district is, now that we are able to pivot to, now that Zoom is ubiquitous, right? Like, because it wasn't so much before, we need to find ways to make things more accessible. And I do feel like colleges and have been more on the forefront of that piece, like, because they've been doing online school for a while, but it should be expanded, and the institutions that are difficult to access should allow some type of extension online for people to attend. But like, look, there's always this hierarchy, right? I got my Cornell University Diversity and Inclusion certificate, right? But, they're like, but that's Cornell. So it's not like Cornell, you know what I mean? So there's always going to be the hierarchy of what's worth what, and it'll be based on, unfortunately, it's typically based on have you attended in person. But that accessibility piece is important. And also, with that, we have to understand that not everyone has access to everything everyone has access to. Not everyone has a MacBook Pro, right? So we need to make sure that people have access to the things that give them access to the world and to higher education.
Or in my case, terrible Wi-Fi. But I want to pivot to another question or discussion that's happening in the chat is about the interest rate. What do y'all think about this solution that is being discussed in the chat about what if we lower the interest rates to less than 1%? Would that do anything? What do y'all think about that as perhaps not the ultimate solution? Oh, that's a terrible phrase to use. I'm from a Jewish person, but a incremental step. What do y'all think about that?
I owe $500,000 with capitalized interest. This is what this brain is worth, $500,000. And you can lower the interest rate as much as you want, but I got to tell you, that's still $500,000.
Yeah, I have to agree with Kiyomi. Going forward, we should have zero interest. President LBJ declared they would be free of interest in 1965. No good reason we can't get back to that. But for the 45 million people right now in the country, 40 plus million who are losing sleep over the loans, it's not going to do much. People say, oh, well, maybe I just want to break on the interest. Well, there's no way that you can write legislation that actually cancels interest, unfortunately, because the Byzantine nature of particularly older loans that have been bought and sold, and the history has been lost. You literally can't write code that anyone can follow and actually cancel interest. So what I tell people who bring that up is, with the threat of bankruptcy back on our side, people who want a moderate interest break, that can happen. And it probably will happen with that threat on the table. That's about the best I can do.
My question too is also in terms of this question of transparency. And I think about some of the very important things that came out of Jon Oberg's testimony. His whistleblowing was in the 2008 Higher Education Act reauthorization. There was unprecedented new data collection, which is why we have the data that we have now. It was such an important step in recognizing the totality of this crisis. But you know what? I've actually seen those tables that you can see in the Department of Education. I have actually looked and seen what it looks like, what college and universities put up about what they estimate your costs are and all these other kinds of things. But it's actually not that transparency. And that's the important work done at the Hope Center by Sarah Goldrick-Robb. What would it take to truly be transparent to make the choices about where we are now, not where we want to go? Maybe this would be something to get us to where we go to with this idea. A couple of you have put out there about free college, or at least at the public level. What do you think about that? What would it make to make the cost of college, the reality of it, truly transparent?
I can speak to that. One of the remarkable, I would say, sociologically exquisite features of higher education in the United States is their internal cross-subsidy. These are organizations that do a staggeringly diverse range of things. They do astrophysics, art history, archery, football, field hockey, conference services. And in fact, their durability is in large measure built along their ability to cross-subsidize. I would suggest that the universities themselves probably couldn't explain to you how the web of cross-subsidy works. And of course, that opacity has protected institutions and by giving them a lot of internal flexibility and a lot of exemption from scrutiny. But now that we live in a world where many people like Kiyomi, are indebted by $500,000 by virtue of their relationship with schools, schools are now called upon to explain price in ways that they never were before. And to me, that is a very important political challenge, certainly for colleges and universities, one that we should call them to. But I think it's also the task of universities to explain why it is that all of these bundled practices should somehow go together, right? Why is the subsidy of Olympic scale athletes, a tax subsidized endeavor? Why is every palm tree and every blade of grass on every private university in the state of California, subsidized by the federal government and the people of the state of California? There aren't easy answers to that question. And I don't think that a transparency discussion is the right frame. To me, it's more a question of, again, who is responsible for paying for the entire bundle, right? Whose university is Stanford University? Whose endowment is that, right? And what does it mean for the institution I work for to be a responsible civic actor? That's the question that I think needs to be reassessed, both by universities and their publics. And I think that's frankly a different question than having each and every dollar of a tuition bill itemized for a potential purchaser.
Point taken. And I actually am so glad that you brought this up about where the endowments come from. What endowments? I would like to shout out the incredible project done, the Land Grab University Project, a digital project, which is actually tracing the violent seizure in many cases of native lands to be sold for the university endowments. And especially since in the chat, we had some folks weighing in as Indigenous audience members about where is their free education. So much of their land is done that. And I think it's so important to this question, but I also would like to give a nod to those who are interested, the incredible scholar, historian, Devarian Baldwin, and he will actually do at college universities, recognizing exactly what Mitchell said. It's not just administrators who don't know where the money's going and the money crossing and what makes it, what it takes, but faculty themselves. And especially as faculty now are becoming more energized, he will actually lead the teach-ins. He's done these about showing where the money is actually coming from in these cases. And I'm an educator. I think education and then speaking about it and talking about it is a really important way forward in this question. Other things.
I want to add one more thing.
Go for it.
I want to be sure and assure my employer of my faith in the core of its mission. And here's the thing, I think that colleges and universities, both public and private, have enjoyed the great trust of the American people. And over again, they have rewarded that trust by making enormous contributions to the public good in this country. They are being called upon again to make a different kind of contribution, a contribution that they may not themselves quite understand. We shouldn't forget that universities recommitted themselves to the promise of diversity in access and inclusion in response to the civil rights and Black Power movement. And I have every confidence that the nation's universities can respond to this claim for accountability and affordability. They can create new narratives, new ways of thinking about their own mission. They can give new gifts to the American people. But I don't think they'll do that unless they are called upon to do that. And so deeply believes that the nation's university leaders can and will rise to the challenge we are creating. But the challenge needs to be coherent and clear. And so I guess I'm suggesting let's continue to hone the conversation and include the nation's most esteemed universities in that exchange.
And I'd love to.
Ellie, just really quickly, we're talking a lot about scholars, and I want to make sure to talk about a scholar I know, Indentured Students, written by Ellie here. Seriously, this is it, right? If you want to learn more about this issue, she's got it all in here, right? So thank you, Ellie. I just didn't want you to be left out of the scholar conversation.
I appreciate that, but I wouldn't be the scholar that I am without the many people, and actually not just scholars, but actually the activists that I've learned from, the policymakers that I learned from, my students who I've learned from too. And I want to emphasize that I am not one of the historians, because I've been on those Zoom calls where they have the book right behind them. Those are none of those books are mine.
I know. I wanted to do that for you because you're not that guy.
I love that Mitchell brought us back to this question of the political challenge at hand. Oh, and actually, Jon, I'm sorry, you wanted to jump in. I apologize.
Yes, I just wanted to answer your question a little bit on the 2008 reauthorization and the net price calculator. That's very good that we have that in. And I'm not sure how useful that is, because how many people really check that net price calculator up on the Department of Education's website? The transparency is not just all in net price. It is also how the financial aid package is put together. I don't know how many of you have actually read the lawsuit against the 16 elite institutions known as the 568 cartel. But in those, they all say, no, we are not going to say this is proprietary information. We are not going to show you how we put packages together that result in higher net price for the financially needy. There is a remedy for this. It is at the Secretary of Education's level, who can say, no, according to 20 U.S. Code 1092, and regulations on it, this is public information. The individuals must be given this. So we look at the idea that elite institutions leadership are going to be up to the challenge. Here's an immediate challenge. And of course, it isn't just those 16 institutions. It's 116 or 1,016 that practice these techniques known as enrollment management, and they insist, and the Department of Education has not enforced the law to say this has to be public information. If there is any federal connection to the package, we have to see the whole package.
And Jonathan wants to jump in.
I need to make 2 points. One having to do with disclosure. I want to emphasize what both Professor Stevens and Dr. Oberg were saying. I'm not sure that disclosure will necessarily affect behavior. I don't know that students necessarily feel as though they have a choice when confronted with higher education, and the messaging around higher education is so consistent and so powerful over time. But even if they do want to take it into account to make meaningful use of the information, they've got to make predictions about what we know from Ruby Bear is really hard to make predictions about, which is the future. They don't know what their lives are going to look like after they graduate, if they graduate, and we know that the students who are going to be most burdened are those that actually do not graduate. So disclosure alone, even if students pay attention to it to make best use of the information, they're really not well placed to figure it out. The other thing I want to point out just about the lawsuit against the 16 selective colleges and universities, it's an antitrust argument that they're making in the complaint, right? That there's collusion is the basis of the argument. There's a provision, or there's actually a note to the Sherman Act that exempts the institutions from application of antitrust law if they're need blind in their admissions decisions. And so the complaint is arguing the institutions are not need blind, therefore the exemption doesn't apply, therefore they're violating the Antitrust Act. I just want to make sure that we see the argument that the plaintiffs are trying to make. It's then from there, the next step to say that as a result, they are providing less financial aid than they otherwise would to admitted students.
I think that's such an important end to start us bringing us to a close, because it talks about knowing the real complexity of these issues involved and the cases involved and all these things. It also brings us back to not just Mitchell, talking about focused collective action, but also Camoin talking about it, Jon's bravery about coming forward, but also I have to come back to Alan, because one of the things that has been so powerful and meaningful for me as I go through our Q&A is the many of you who have so bravely shared your own stories of being an indentured student. And I thank you for that. And I do actually want to give credit again to Alan. Starting student loan justice back in 2005, it was so important. And to be a part of the Occupy movement, to normalize the debt that so many Americans have found themselves in for basic needs, not just education, but healthcare and so many other things. And we really owe a debt to all of you who have come together to share, to be with us tonight, to ask your questions, and to keep this movement going. And at that note, I do need to hand things back over to Steve Ross to end this evening's program.
I want to thank Elizabeth, Jon, Camoin, Alan, Jonathan, and Mitchell for sharing your perspectives on the moral, economic, and spiritual need for a drastic revision of our student lending system in America. I want to thank Elizabeth particularly for facilitating tonight's discussion. And I want to thank our audience for giving their time to come in and hear us. And I think I speak on behalf of all our panelists when I say that we hope to see meaningful change to end this predatory system and open opportunities for all to pursue higher education without crippling debt. I know that I was a first-generation college student in my family, like many others, and student loans certainly helped me. Fortunately, I didn't have to take so much that it crippled me, but it is still the best way for advancement in our society, in our country. And to deny that to so many people, particularly people who don't have money and can't go to school and can't advance across generational wealth. This is, as we would say in Yiddish, a shanda that has to be fixed. On behalf of the Casden Institute, the Stanford University Pathways Lab, the Center for the Study of Work, Labor and Democracy, and the Feminist Features Project at UC Santa Barbara, I thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.